They didn't know that the man they called a dead end would become the reason our family has any future worth talking about. The last time I sat at my parents' dining table in Oakville, Ontario, my father Douglas Harrington, senior partner at Harrington and Wells Family Law, 22 years on the Law Society of Ontario's Discipline Committee, looked across the white linen and told me that I was throwing away every advantage they had ever built for me. He said it quietly, the way he said everything. My father never needed to raise his voice. The weight of his disappointment was enough. I was 23 years old. I had just told them I was moving in with Marcus Kowalski, 30 years old, journeyman pipefitter with Local 663 out of Hamilton. The man I had been in love with for 2 years, the man who had shown up to every one of my late shifts at the Starbucks on King Street when I was still finishing my business degree at McMaster, the man who once drove 4 hours in a February snowstorm to sit with me in a hospital waiting room when my grandmother had her first stroke. My father knew all of this. It didn't matter. A pipefitter, my mother said, and she said it the way you'd say the name of something you found under the kitchen sink. Her name is Catherine Harrington. She sits on the board of 2 charities in Oakville. She went to Queen's University. She has never, in my memory, taken out her own garbage. I told them I loved him. My father set down his fork. He looked at me the way he looked at opposing counsel when he had already won and was simply waiting for them to realize it. He said, "You can make whatever choice you want, but you will not make it under our roof, with our money, and with our name attached to it. If you walk out of here with him, we are done. Not angry, done." I thought he was bluffing. He was not bluffing. I moved out 3 days later. Marcus came with his truck, a 2009 F-150 he'd bought used, and kept running himself, and we loaded everything I owned into the bed, and we drove to the bachelor apartment he rented in Hamilton, near the waterfront, and I sat on the tailgate afterward while he made us coffee, on a 2-burner stove, and I thought, I have made a catastrophic mistake, or I have made the only honest decision of my life. I genuinely did not know which. What I knew was that my phone was quiet, no texts from my mother, no call from my father, not even anything from my older brother, Patrick, who was articling at my father's firm, and who had always, his entire life, found a way to agree with whatever my father said. That silence lasted longer than I ever thought silence could last. Marcus and I got married 14 months later at the Hamilton courthouse. No reception, no venue, no florist. His parents, his mother Irina, his father Bogdan, both of them retired, and living in a semi-detached in Stony Creek, brought a cake Irina had made herself, a Polish walnut cake that she'd stayed up until midnight baking. His sister Zofia cried through the whole thing. My side of the room was empty. I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt. It hurt the way things hurt when you finally understand that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally had conditions the whole time, and you just hadn't found them yet. But I will tell you what happened next. Marcus was good at his work. Not just competent, genuinely skilled, the kind of skilled that other tradespeople notice and talk about. Within 2 years, he was a foreman on commercial jobs. Within 4, he had his Red Seal certification and was being brought in as a lead on industrial projects, refineries, processing plants, the kind of infrastructure work that holds a country together without anyone in a boardroom ever thinking about it. He started a small contracting company with 2 friends from his local in 2017. By 2020, when everything else was falling apart, they were busier than they had ever been, because essential infrastructure does not stop for a pandemic. I finished my business degree and went back for a CPA designation. I worked for 3 years at a mid-size accounting firm in Hamilton, and then I went to work for Marcus's company as their financial controller. We bought a house in Dundas in 2019. Nothing dramatic. A 1970s split level on a quiet street, big backyard, needed work. Marcus did most of the work himself on weekends. Our daughter, Nadia, was born in 2018. She had Marcus's dark eyes and my stubborn mouth, and she was, from her first day, completely herself in a way that made me understand why people say, "Children choose you." My parents did not send a card. Irina and Bogdan drove to the hospital in a snowstorm, and Irina held Nadia for 40 minutes and cried quietly and said things in Polish that I didn't understand but understood completely. That was the day I stopped grieving my own parents and started understanding what family actually meant. We sent my parents a birth announcement. A real one. Paper. With a photograph. My mother sent back a brief email. I can only assume from the tone that she consulted my father before sending it, that said they wished us well, and hoped we were making responsible decisions. That was it. That was the entirety of her response to the existence of her grandchild. I didn't respond. I want to be precise about the timeline, because I think it matters. For 6 years, my parents and I had no real contact. Occasional emails on Christmas, nothing else. 6 years of Nadia's life they chose not to be part of. 6 years of Marcus building something from nothing, while my father wrote briefs in his Oakville office, and my mother attended charity galas, and they lived exactly as they had always lived, as though the daughter who had disagreed with them had simply stopped existing. Then, in the fall of 2023, my brother Patrick called me. Patrick and I had not spoken meaningfully in 4 years. He had built his life exactly according to our father's specifications. Articled at the firm, made associate, married a woman named Stephanie, who had gone to Upper Canada College and whose father was a radiologist in Rosedale. They lived 20 minutes from our parents. Patrick played golf with my father on Sundays. He was, by every external measure, the son my father had designed. So when he called, I almost didn't pick up. I picked up. He said, "Something has happened with Dad. Something financial." He said he wasn't sure how to explain it. He said, and I remember this exactly because of how strange it was to hear Patrick say anything that wasn't carefully managed. He said, "It's bad, Claire. Like, actually bad." I listened. What Patrick told me, over the course of an hour, was this. My father had been a named partner at the firm for over 2 decades. 3 years earlier, the firm had taken on a series of contingency cases, high-value litigation they had agreed to fund themselves in exchange for a percentage of any settlement. The cases had gone badly, one after another. The firm had borrowed to cover the costs, then borrowed again. When the last major case collapsed in 2022, the firm was carrying debt that it could not service. Harrington and Wells had quietly dissolved 8 months ago. My father had lost his partnership stake. He and my mother had used the equity in their Oakville home to try to cover some of the personal guarantees he had signed. The house was now listed for sale. I sat with that for a moment. Then Patrick said, "They need help." He said it quickly, the way you say things you've been building up to. He said my father was too proud to ask directly, and my mother was his words struggling, and they were looking at renting something in Mississauga, and my father was trying to find work as a consultant, but it was slow, and they were both 63 years old, and the picture was not good. I said, "Patrick, why are you calling me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you and Marcus are the only people in this family who actually built something." I sat in my kitchen in Dundas for a long time after I hung up. Nadia was at school. The house was quiet. I could hear Marcus's truck pulling into the driveway. I heard him come in through the side door, heard him take off his boots, heard him open the fridge. And then he came and found me at the kitchen table, and he took one look at my face, and he sat down across from me and said, "Tell me." So I told him. Marcus has never been the kind of person who performs his reactions. He listened to everything. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I didn't know. He said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But I want you to decide it for you, not out of guilt, not out of what you think you're supposed to feel. What do you actually want?" That question took me 3 weeks to answer. Here is what I had to sit with. My father had told me, clearly, and without cruelty, that my choices disqualified me from being his daughter. He had enforced that for 6 years. He had never met Nadia. He had sent one email acknowledging her birth. He had watched us build a life and said nothing. Now the architecture of the life he had valued over me had collapsed, and he needed something. I thought about the woman at the courthouse with the empty chairs on her side of the room. I thought about Irina's cake. I thought about what Nadia would understand about this when she was old enough to understand it. I thought about what it would mean to help and what it would mean not to. Both of them had weight. Neither of them felt simple. I called a family therapist, a woman named Dr. Adaez Obi, who practiced out of a Westdale office, and I made an appointment, and then I made a second one, and eventually I had the language for what I was actually dealing with. Not the story of whether my parents deserved help. The story of who I wanted to be, independent of what they deserved. That took a while longer. Meanwhile, Patrick told me my mother had been asking about Nadia, not asking to see her. Nothing that direct. Just asking Patrick whether Nadia was doing well, what she was like, whether she looked like me. Patrick said he'd shown my mother a photo from Nadia's 5th birthday, the one Zofia had posted, the one with the balloons, and Nadia's face completely covered in chocolate cake, and that my mother had kept it open on her phone for a long time, without saying anything. I don't know why that detail hit me the way it did. Marcus's company, by this point, was doing work that I could not have imagined when we drove away from Oakville in that F-150. They had 11 full-time employees and a roster of subcontractors. They had completed 2 contracts for industrial facilities in Sarnia and 1 for a food processing plant near Guelph. Marcus had been approached by a larger firm about acquisition and had politely declined. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he was good at, and he had built it without a single favor from anyone who had a golf membership or a seat on a board. My father, who had told me that a pipefitter had nothing to offer, had spent his career moving other people's money around inside a system that had eventually eaten him. I am not saying that to be cruel. I am saying it because I needed to understand it before I could move forward. In February of 2024, I drove to Mississauga alone. Marcus offered to come. I told him I needed to do this part by myself. My parents were renting a 2-bedroom condo in a mid-rise near Square One. It was clean, and it was fine, and it was so far from the Oakville house that it might as well have been another country. My mother opened the door. She had gotten older in a way that I hadn't been there to see. Gradually, it had all happened at once, between the last time I'd seen her and now. Her hair was fully silver. She looked smaller. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "You came." I said, "I came." We sat in the living room. My father came in from the bedroom. He was wearing a sweater I didn't recognize. He sat across from me in an armchair, and he folded his hands, and for the first time in my life, Douglas Harrington looked like someone who did not know what was about to happen next. I had thought about what I wanted to say for weeks. I had written some of it down and crossed it out. What I ended up saying, sitting in their rented living room in Mississauga, was simpler than anything I had written. I said, "I'm not here to make you pay for what happened. I'm here because Nadia is 6 years old and she doesn't have grandparents on my side, and that is not her fault. And I don't want to keep that from her if there's something real on the other side of it." My father looked at the floor. My mother said, "We were wrong." She said it plainly, without framing it, without the qualifications I had expected. She said, "I was wrong about Marcus, and I was wrong about what I said to you, and I was wrong to stay silent for 6 years. I have no defense for it. I'm just telling you it's true." I waited to see if my father would say something. He said, "Everything your mother just said." He cleared his throat. He said, "Marcus built something real. You built something real. I spent 20 years making arguments for a living, and I don't have an argument for how I handled this. That was not everything I wanted. It was not a complete accounting. It was not 6 years of missed birthdays returned to me, but it was real, and I had learned by then, in Dr. Obi's office on Tuesday evenings, that real was what I was looking for. Not perfect, real. I told them I wasn't in a position to offer financial support directly, that Marcus and I had our own obligations, our mortgage, our employees, Nadia's future. But I told them I could help them look at what they had left and make a plan that was actually workable. My CPA designation meant something in this room in a way it had not been allowed to mean anything before. My father nodded once. He did not say thank you. He said, That would be useful. Which, from Douglas Harrington, was the closest thing to gratitude I was likely to get, and I had made my peace with that. I drove home, and Marcus was sitting on the front porch with 2 mugs of tea, even though it was cold, because he had been watching from my car. I sat down beside him, and took the mug, and didn't say anything for a minute. He said, "How'd it go?" I said, "It went like real things go. Complicated." He put his arm around me. I said, "She called me wrong. My mom. She just said it." He said, "Good." We sat on the porch for a while. Down the street, someone was raking leaves. The sky over Dundas was doing that thing it does in late winter where it can't quite decide if it's still gray or starting to be blue. Nadia would be home from school in an hour. I want to tell you the thing I came to understand through all of it, because I think it's the thing that actually matters. My parents built their identity out of what they had: the credentials, the address, the professional associations, the idea that certain choices were beneath them. When the structure that held all of that up gave way, there was very little underneath it. That's not a judgment, it's just what I watched happen. Marcus built his identity out of what he could do, out of showing up, out of knowing his trade, out of keeping his word to the people who worked for him. When things got hard, and things got hard, pandemic hard, project failed hard, cash flow hard, there was something underneath it. There was the work. There was Irina's phone calls. There was the crew that had followed him from job to job because they trusted him. I don't think there's a lesson in that for anyone but me. I'm not saying tradespeople are more virtuous than lawyers. I'm saying my specific father confused status with substance, and my specific husband was made of something that didn't depend on anyone agreeing with him. Nadia met my parents for the first time in March of 2024. We drove to Mississauga on a Saturday morning. Nadia held Marcus's hand in the elevator and asked if her other grandma and grandpa were nice. Marcus said, "They're learning." She thought about that and said okay, as if it made complete sense, which maybe to a 6-year-old it did. My mother had bought a puzzle, one of those floor puzzles with the big pieces, a map of Canada, which felt unintentional in its symbolism but was probably just what she found at Indigo. Nadia sat on the carpet with her, and they did the puzzle together for 40 minutes, and I sat in the kitchen with my father, and we talked about his consulting work, and I ran through a few numbers with him, and it was almost ordinary. It was almost like what it might have been, if the last 6 years had gone differently. After, in the car, Nadia said, "I like them," she said. "Grandma Catherine smells like nice soap." And then she fell asleep between Hamilton and Dundas, with her cheek against the window. I looked at Marcus driving, and he glanced over at me, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. My father-in-law Bogdan turned 70 last summer. We had a party in our backyard in Dundas. Marcus built a deck the year before, and we'd never really broken it in properly. Irina made 3 kinds of food, and Zofia brought her kids, and the neighbors came over the fence, and at some point in the evening, I looked around at who was there and I thought, this is what my father was afraid of. This. A man who works with his hands, a backyard, a too loud family, a kid running through the sprinkler in September because it was still warm and she didn't want to admit the summer was over. My parents came. My mother brought flowers. My father shook Marcus's hand, and Marcus shook his back, and nothing dramatic happened because real things, mostly, are not dramatic. They just happen, and then you live in them. I used to think that the story was about what my parents did to me. I think now it was about what I found out I was made of when they did it. Marcus fixed wires. He laid pipe in industrial plants in the middle of nowhere. He came home with his hands dirty, and he made coffee on a 2-burner stove, and he showed up in February snowstorms, and he built a company that employs 11 people, and he learned to make Bogdan's beet soup from a recipe that Irina made him practice 3 times before she said it was acceptable. And my parents, in a rented condo in Mississauga, are figuring out who they are without the things they used to use to explain themselves. I think that's harder than anything Marcus and I ever did. I think I can have some compassion for that, now that it isn't my job to fix it. Nadia wants to be a structural engineer. She told me this in the car last month. Very seriously, the way she announces things. She said she wants to build bridges because bridges are useful, and also because they're beautiful, and she doesn't see why those have to be different things. I looked in the rearview mirror at her face, and I thought about my grandfather, who never existed, the one my father invented when he said we came from 4 generations of something worth protecting. I thought about Irina's cake. I thought about the empty chairs. I said, "You know, your dad would be really good at helping you with that." She said, "I know. He already said he'd teach me how to read blueprints." Marcus, without looking up from the road, said, "Next weekend." And that was that.